Hello class, welcome to my lecture on MLA citations. And here we're going to go over, of course, citations that we're going to use, or I want you to use in my class, especially for the three main assignments. So for your first assignment, I want you to make sure to try and use MLA citations. Now, if you don't get it quite correct, that's fine, but I want you to make the attempt to use citations both in the text of your paper and in the works cited page. And I'll give you an example of that once we get towards the end of this lecture. So let's get into it. So MLA just stands for Model Language Association, in case you're ever wondering, just something I bring up. But more importantly, why do we cite? Well, we cite because we want to, of course, give credit to the sources we use to make sure that we're giving evidence and that we're pulling numbers that are important, or pulling sources that are important and, at the end of the day, help us build our credibility, right? As such, it is very important, especially in academic settings, that we cite our sources and give credit. That's things I mentioned. There's three ways to cite specifically. One is summarizing, two is paraphrasing, and three is quoting an author's work, right? You may be familiar with some of these, but I want to make sure that all our bases are covered because I do want you to try to use whichever one you specifically like, but to do it correctly. So summary. Summary, of course, you briefly encapsulate somebody's main ideas and you bring it into your paper, right? In this case, you use your own words, but you summarize maybe their whole scope of what they're doing. So maybe instead of so say you had a book, right? And you're not going to use any particular part of that book. You're just going to summarize the whole book for the reader, right? And that's fine. But you still need to, of course, make sure you give credit to the author because this summary isn't your work. The idea is that those arguments that you are making or that you got, you want to make sure you're citing correctly. The next, of course, is a paraphrase. Basically, it's a restatement of somebody's words. So maybe they have a quote and you're like, oh, that quote's good, but I think I can clarify it or make it work better in my paper. That's fine. That's why we paraphrase. But you still need to cite that paraphrase because that idea that you got isn't your own. It's somebody else's, and you want to make sure you give their credit to that author. And of course, last is a quotation, which you just literally just take their exact words, put them into your work, and then you use quotes around whatever you used, and then you cite it. As we have here, here's two examples. One, a noted scientist states, and then here's the quotes, 100 years ago, the average temperature of the Earth was about 13.7 C. Today it's closer to 14.4 C. And then the quotes end here, silver 11. And notice something here, right? The quotation marks cover the quote only. So after the quote, you'll have silver 11 and then the period goes here. That's because silver 11 isn't part of the quote, right? It's just giving credit to the author. As such, you do not include it in the quotation marks. So try to follow this format here. In this example, it's exact same information. Instead of quoting it though, so taking the author's words verbatim or word for word, you are actually paraphrasing. So you're using your own words now to use this information. A noted scientist observes the Earth's current average temperature is 57.9 F compared to 56.5 F 100 years ago, silver 11. Both are perfectly fine. This one, though, you wanted to use your own words, but you still cited them. This one, you wanted to quote them, but you still cited them, okay? That's the big difference between a paraphrase and a quotation. Here's some more examples. Here's a direct quote. Teresa states, you are the land's pollution, to Odysseus, and then Sophocles 390. Oh, notice also another thing before I move on. In MLA, very important, you always use the author's last name and the page number. Okay? That is what's most important. What would you do with a web source? I'll get into that later, but for now, know this. No matter what kind of source you have, if there's an author, that always goes here. Author's last name. And with MLA, we always use the page number. Now, but hey, you might not have page numbers because it's a web source. Totally fine. I'll get into that later. One thing I do want to mention, though, is that we never use the year in MLA. That's APA, okay? And I'm not going to cover that in here, just MLA. So don't use the year. There's always a page number, not always a page number, but there's always two parts to this though. Last name, and then of course the page number in this case. And I'll get into what else you would have once we get to that part. Anyways, here's some more examples. Here's the same thing but paraphrased. Here are just some direct quotes, and you can use them in different ways. Here's with a colon, so Odysseus will not listen, colon. I'm sure you're wrong, Creon, and then usually would have the citations here, but these are just for examples. Here's with the comma, when he says, comma, you are not the right you seek, comma, and then of course this is quoted. Tiresias is telling the audience that his patience with Odysseus has ended. I don't know how to say Tiresias. I don't know, whatever. The next one is no punctuation. So you don't have to use any kind of commas or colons or anything like that. It just works with your sentence. Others have described Odysseus as cold, calculating, and evil. And then, of course, you would cite it here. It might be Sophocles 390 or whatever. Anyways, just a couple different ways. And use what's comfortable to you. Copy this if you like, whatever. Just practice is what's most important. Punctuation, punctuating citations and quotes. Here, this is just using punctuation with your quotes. So when talking to Odysseus, Tiresias states, we have a comma here, you are the land's pollution. And then here's the same thing. Just some ways of using grammar with your quotes. Here's an important thing. Say you have a very large quote, right? It's huge, but it's very, good. It's something you really want to use, and you don't want to paraphrase it because you don't think you can do it justice. But you know that it's just too long. You don't want to use the whole quote because, man, that would just take like a whole page, and that would just not make you look like you know what you're doing, right? You may make you look like an amateur writer, and that's not what you want. But you do want to use the quote. So what do? So you use these three ellipses, which is these three dots, 1, 2, 3. That lets the reader know that there's more to this quote, but you didn't add it because you deemed it not necessary. So here we have, when desire is understood as lust, where lust is equated with the basic human drive, its historical production becomes invisible. ... Those ellipses. This tells us, of course, oh, there's more to this, but he's not using it, or he or she is not using it. Invocations of lust as national experience, a natural experience to which women have a right, can limit our thinking about human agency. ... Quotation marks here, Hennessy 185. As you can see, there's more to this quote, but the author didn't include it because it wasn't necessary for whatever point they were trying to make. That's perfectly fine to do. Okay, it's a more advanced thing, but that's kind of what you want to try to do. Especially if you have a really large quote, don't put it into your paper. It's just not going to be a good way to go about writing. Okay, if half of your page is a quote, you should do this instead. All right, or paraphrase the quote, because having a whole paragraph of somebody else's work isn't the best way to make a point, because it's not, you're trying to get your author to make your argument, and that's not how writing works, or at least good rhetorical writing works. Including your own words in a quote. Basically, you have a quote here, but maybe something's misspelled, or it has a different meaning, so you want to fix it in a sense, right? Or clarify something. So what you do is add brackets around the word you changed, or words you changed, and that lets the reader know that, oh, this is not the original quote as it stood, that the reader changed something, but for the most part, it's the work of the author. So here we have that exact same quote that we had here, but every time they said lust, we change it to yearning, because in this sense, he didn't really mean lust like we think lust means. He meant it as yearning, as if you're yearning for something. When we think of lust today, we think of more of sexual desire, but that's not quite what Hennessy was talking about. He wasn't talking about sexual desire. He was talking about yearning for something. And what that yearning is, I don't know, but that's the idea here. In this example here, we're trying to clarify which Stephen he was working for, right? So in the original quote, it was just, Stephen was one of the best directors I ever worked with. Okay, why would we care? No, we meant Steven Spielberg. Of course, the original quote didn't have the author's last name, or the last name here, but the writer put Spielberg here because they wanted to make sure that the reader understood who they were talking about, right? Not just any old Steven, but Steven Spielberg, a big director. And that's why you would use, that's how you would include your own words into a quote that's already been made or been given. And you, of course, still cite it, which this one still needs a citation here. So how to cite? This is the big thing, okay? This is the thing you need to pay attention to when it comes to writing a paper. You want to cite, of course, in two ways. One is in brief in-text citation, which is the parenthetical, which is what we have here with Hennessy 185. And then, of course, you're going to need a full citation in the works cited page that requires a lot more information about whatever sources you use to let the reader understand where they can find that exact source and find exactly where you found your work, right? To make sure it's credible, right? So let's go in and look at that in more detail, but let's cut the first part here because this video is already getting too long and I don't want to make it overly long in case you want to take a break. So we will look at how this looks inside an actual paper in the next part. So see you there.